Chapter 4. Theory of Force, Conclusion. Quote, "It is a circumstance of great importance that, as a matter of fact, the domination over nature, generally speaking, quote, only preceded," Engels adds in parentheses, "a domination preceded, quote, through the domination over man. The cultivation of landed property in tracts of considerable size never took place anywhere without the antecedent subjection of man, in some form of slave labor or corvée. The establishment of an economic domination over things has presupposed the political, social, and economic domination of man over man. How could a large landed proprietor even be conceived without at once including in this idea also his domination over slaves, serfs, or others indirectly unfree? What could the efforts of an individual, at most supplemented by those of his family, have signified or signify in extensively practiced agriculture, the exploitation of the land, or the extension of economic control over it on a scale exceeding the natural capacities of the individual, was only made possible in previous history by the establishment, either before or simultaneously with the introduction of dominion over land, of the enslavement of man which this involves. In the later periods of development, this servitude was mitigated. Its present form in the more highly civilized states is wage labor, to a greater or lesser degree carried on under police rule. Thus, wage labor provides the practical possibility of that form of contemporary wealth, which is represented by dominion over wide areas of land and extensive landed property. It goes without saying that all other types of distributive wealth must be explained historically in a similar way, and the direct dependence of man on man, which is now the essential feature of the conditions which economically are the most fully developed, cannot be understood and explained by its own nature, but only as a somewhat transformed heritage of an earlier direct subjugation and expropriation." Unquote. Thus Herr Dühring. Thesis: the domination of nature by man presupposes the domination of man by man. Proof: the cultivation of landed property in tracts of considerable size never took place anywhere except by the use of bondmen. Proof of the proof: how can there be large landowners without bondmen, as the large landowner, even with his family, could work only a tiny part of his property without the help of bondmen? Therefore, in order to prove that man first had to subjugate man before he could bring nature under his control, Herr Dühring transforms nature, without more ado, into, quote, landed property in tracts of considerable size. And then this landed property, ownership unspecified, is immediately further transformed into the property of a large landed proprietor, who naturally cannot work his land without bondmen. In the first place, quote, domination over nature and the, quote, cultivation of landed property are by no means the same thing. In industry, domination over nature is exercised on quite another, much greater scale than in agriculture, which is still subject to weather conditions instead of controlling them. Secondly, if we confine ourselves to the cultivation of landed property consisting of tracts of considerable size, the question arises, whose landed property is it? And then we find in the early history of all civilized peoples, not the, quote, large landed proprietors, whom Herr Dühring interpolates here with his customary sleight of hand, which he calls, quote, natural dialectics, but tribal and village communities with common ownership of the land. From India to Ireland, the cultivation of landed property in tracts of considerable size was originally carried on by such tribal and village communities. Sometimes the arable land was tilled jointly for account of the community, and sometimes in separate parcels of land temporarily allotted to families by the community, while woodland and pasture land continued to be used in common. It is once again characteristic of the, quote, most exhaustive specialized studies made by Herr Dühring, quote, in the domain of politics and law, that he knows nothing of all this, that all his works breathe total ignorance of Maurer's epic-making writings on the primitive constitution of the German mark, the basis of all German law, and of the ever-increasing mass of literature, chiefly stimulated by Maurer, which is devoted to proving the primitive common ownership of the land among all civilized peoples of Europe and Asia, and to showing the various forms of its existence and dissolution. Just as in the domain of French and English law, Herr Dühring, quote, himself acquired all his ignorance, great as it was, so it is with even much greater ignorance in the domain of German law. In this domain, the man who flies into such a violent rage over the limited horizon of university professors is himself today at the very most still where those professors were 20 years ago. It is a pure, quote, free creation and imagination on Herr Dühring's part when he asserts that landed proprietors and bondmen were required for the cultivation of landed property in tracts of considerable size. In the whole of the Orient, where the village community or the state owns the land, the very term landlord is not to be found in the various languages, a point on which Herr Dühring can consult the English jurists, whose efforts in India to solve the question, who is the owner of the land, were as vain as those of the late Prince Heinrich the 72nd of Reuss, Greitz, Schleitz, Lobenstein, Eberswalde, in his attempts to solve the question of who was the night watchman. It was the Turks who first introduced a sort of feudal ownership of land in the countries conquered by them in the Orient. Greece made its entry into history as far back as the heroic epoch, with a system of social estates which itself was evidently the product of a long but unknown prehistory. Even there, however, the land was mainly cultivated by independent peasants. The larger estates of the nobles and tribal chiefs were the exception. Moreover, they disappeared soon after. Italy was brought under cultivation chiefly by peasants. When, in the final period of the Roman Republic, the great complexes of estates, the latifundia, displaced the small peasants and replaced them with slaves, they also replaced tillage with stock raising, and, as Pliny already realized, brought Italy to ruin. During the Middle Ages, peasant farming was predominant throughout Europe, especially in bringing virgin soil into cultivation, and in relation to the question we are now considering, it is of no importance whether these peasants had to pay dues, and if so, what dues, to any feudal lords. The colonists from Friesland, Lower Saxony, Flanders, and the Lower Rhine, who brought under cultivation the land east of the Elbe, which had been wrested from the Slavs, did this as free peasants under very favorable quit-rent tenures, and not at all under, quote, some form of corvée. In North America, by far the largest portion of the land was opened for cultivation by the labor of free farmers, while the big landlords of the South, with their slaves and their rapacious tilling of the land, exhausted the soil until it could only grow furs, so that the cultivation of cotton was forced further and further west. In Australia and New Zealand, all attempts of the British government to establish artificially a landed aristocracy came to nothing. In short, if we accept the tropical and subtropical colonies, where the climate makes agricultural labor impossible for Europeans, the big landlord who subjugates nature by means of his slaves or serfs, and brings the land under cultivation proves to be a pure figment of the imagination. The very reverse is the case. Where he makes his appearance in antiquity, as in Italy, he does not bring wasteland into cultivation, but transforms arable land, brought under cultivation by peasants, into stock pastures, depopulating and ruining whole countries. Only in a more recent period, when the increasing density of population had raised the value of land, and particularly since the development of agricultural science had made even poorer land more cultivable, it is only from this period that large landowners began to participate on an extensive scale in bringing wasteland and grassland under cultivation, and this mainly through the robbery of common land from the peasants, both in England and in Germany. But there was another side even to this. For every acre of common land which the large landowners brought into cultivation in England, they transformed at least 3 acres of arable land in Scotland into sheep runs, and eventually even into mere big game hunting grounds. We are concerned here only with Herr Dühring's assertion that the bringing into cultivation of tracts of land of considerable size, and therefore of practically the whole area now cultivated, quote, never and nowhere took place except through the agency of big landlords and their bondsmen, an assertion which, as we have seen, quote, presupposes a really unprecedented ignorance of history. It is not necessary, therefore, for us to examine here either to what extent, at different periods, areas which were already made entirely or mainly cultivable were cultivated by slaves, as in the heyday of Greece, or serfs, as in the manners of the Middle Ages, or what was the social function of the large landowners at various periods. And after Herr Dühring has shown us this masterpiece of the imagination, in which we do not know whether the conjuring trick of deduction or the falsification of history is more to be admired, he exclaims triumphantly, quote, it goes without saying that all other types of distributive wealth must be explained historically in similar manner, unquote, which of course saves him the trouble of wasting even a single word more on the origin, for example, of capital. If, with his domination of man by man as a prior condition for the domination of nature by man, Herr Dühring only wanted to state in a general way that the whole of our present economic order, The level of development now attained by agriculture and industry is the result of a social history which evolved in class antagonisms and relationships of domination and subjection. He is saying something which long ago, ever since the Communist Manifesto, became a commonplace. But the question at issue is how we are to explain the origin of classes and relations based on domination. And if Herr Dühring's only answer is the one word force, we are left exactly where we were at the start. The mere fact that the ruled and exploited have at all times been far more numerous than the rulers and the exploiters, and that therefore it is in the hands of the former that the real force has reposed, is enough to demonstrate the absurdity of the whole force theory. The relationships based on domination and subjection have therefore still to be explained. They arose in two ways. As men originally made their exit from the animal world, in the narrower sense of the term, so they made their entry into history, still half animal, brutal, still helpless in face of the forces of nature, still ignorant of their own strength, and consequently as poor as the animals, and hardly more productive than they. There prevailed a certain equality in the conditions of existence, and for the heads of families also a kind of equality of social position, at least an absence of social classes, which continued among the primitive agricultural communities of the civilized peoples of a later period. In each such community there were, from the beginning, certain common interests, the safeguarding of which had to be handed over to individuals, true, under the control of the community as a whole. Adjudication of disputes, repression of abuse of authority by individuals, control of water supplies, especially in hot countries, and finally, when conditions were still absolutely primitive, religious functions. Such offices are found in aboriginal communities of every period, in the oldest German Marx, and even today in India. They are naturally endowed with a certain measure of authority and are the beginnings of state power. The productive forces gradually increase. The increasing density of the population creates at one point common interests, at another conflicting interests between the separate communities, whose grouping into larger units brings about, in turn, a new division of labor, the setting up of organs to safeguard common interests and combat conflicting interests. These organs which, if only because they represent the common interests of the whole group, hold a special position in relation to each individual community, in certain circumstances even one of opposition, soon make themselves still more independent, partly through heredity of functions, which comes about almost as a matter of course in a world where everything occurs spontaneously, and partly because they become increasingly indispensable owing to the growing number of conflicts with other groups. It is not necessary for us to examine here how this independence of social functions in relation to society increased with time until it developed into domination over society, how he who was originally the servant, where conditions were favorable, changed gradually into the lord, how this lord, depending on the conditions, emerged as an oriental despot or satrap, the dynast of a Greek tribe, chieftain of a Celtic clan, and so on, to what extent he subsequently had recourse to force in the course of this transformation, and how finally the individual rulers united into a ruling class. Here, we are only concerned with establishing the fact that the exercise of a social function was everywhere the basis of political supremacy, and further, that political supremacy has existed for any length of time only when it discharged its social functions. However great the number of despotisms which rose and fell in Persia and India, each was fully aware that, above all, it was the entrepreneur responsible for the collective maintenance of irrigation throughout the river valleys, without which no agriculture was possible there. It was reserved for the enlightened English to lose sight of this in India. They let the irrigation canals and sluices fall into decay, and are now at last discovering, through the regularly recurring famines, that they have neglected the one activity which might have made their rule in India at least as legitimate as that of their predecessors. But alongside this process of formation of classes, another was also taking place. The spontaneously evolved division of labor within the family cultivating the soil made possible, at a certain level of well-being, the incorporation of one or more strangers as additional labor forces. This was especially the case in countries where the old common ownership of the land had already disintegrated, or at least the former joint cultivation had given place to the separate cultivation of parcels of land by the respective families. Production had developed so far that the labor power of a man could now produce more than was necessary for its mere maintenance. The means of maintaining additional labor forces existed, likewise the means of employing them. Labor power acquired a value, but the community itself and the association to which it belonged yielded no available, superfluous labor forces. On the other hand, such forces were provided by war, and war was as old as the simultaneous existence alongside each other of several groups of communities. Up to that time, one had not known what to do with prisoners of war, and had therefore simply killed them. At an even earlier period, eaten them. But at the stage of economic situation which had now been attained, the prisoners acquired value. One therefore let them live and made use of their labor. Thus force, instead of controlling the economic situation, was on the contrary pressed into the service of the economic situation. Slavery had been invented. It soon became the dominant form of production among all peoples who were developing beyond the old community, but in the end was also one of the chief causes of their decay. It was slavery that first made possible the division of labor between agriculture and industry on a larger scale, and thereby also Hellenism, the flowering of the ancient world. Without slavery, no Greek state, no Greek art and science. Without slavery, no Roman Empire. But without the basis laid by Hellenism and the Roman Empire, also no modern Europe. We should never forget that our whole economic, political, and intellectual development presupposes a state of things in which slavery was as necessary as it was universally recognized. In this sense, we are entitled to say, without the slavery of antiquity, no modern socialism. It is very easy to inveigh against slavery and similar things in general terms, and to give vent to high moral indignation at such infamies. Unfortunately, all that this conveys is only what everyone knows, namely, that these institutions of antiquity are no longer in accord with our present conditions and our sentiments, which these conditions determine. But it does not tell us one word as to how these institutions arose, why they existed, and what role they played in history. And when we examine these questions, we are compelled to say, however contradictory and heretical it may sound, that the introduction of slavery under the conditions prevailing at that time was a great step forward. For it is a fact that man sprang from the beasts, and had consequently to use barbaric and almost bestial means to extricate himself from barbarism. Where the ancient communities have continued to exist, they have for thousands of years formed the basis of the cruelest form of state, Oriental despotism, from India to Russia. It was only where these communities dissolved that the peoples made progress of themselves, and their next economic advance consisted in the increase and development of production by means of slave labor. It is clear that so long as human labor was still so little productive that it provided but a small surplus over and above the necessary means of subsistence, any increase of the productive forces, extension of trade, development of the state and of law, or foundation of art and science was possible only by means of a greater division of labor. And the necessary basis for this was the great division of labor between the masses discharging simple manual labor and the few privileged persons directing labor, conducting trade and public affairs, and, at a later stage, occupying themselves with art and science. The simplest and most natural form of this division of labor was in fact slavery. In the historical conditions of the ancient world, and particularly of Greece, the advance to a society based on class antagonisms could be accomplished only in the form of slavery. This was an advance even for the slaves. The prisoners of war, from whom the mass of the slaves was recruited, now at least saved their lives, instead of being killed, as they had been before, or even roasted, as at a still earlier period. We may add at this point that all historical antagonisms between exploiting and exploited, ruling and oppressed classes to this very day, find their explanation in the same relatively undeveloped human labor. So long as the really working population were so much occupied with their necessary labor that they had no time left for looking after the common affairs of society, the direction of labor, affairs of state, legal matters, art, science, etc., so long was it necessary that there should constantly exist a special class, freed from actual labor, to manage these affairs. And this class never failed, for its own advantage, to impose a greater and greater burden of labor on the working masses. Only the immense increase of the productive forces attained by modern industry has made it possible to distribute labor among all members of society without exception, and thereby to limit the labor time of each individual member to such an extent that all have enough free time left to take part in the general, both theoretical and practical, affairs of society. It is only now, therefore, that every ruling and exploited class has become superfluous and indeed a hindrance to social development. And it is only now, too, that it will be inexorably abolished, however much it may be in possession of, quote, direct force. So commenting, which I really haven't done in this chapter so far, that's really important. What Marx and Engels propose is that in the past, because of the low productivity of the technology available at the time, the really working population were so much occupied with their necessary labor that they had no time left for looking after the common affairs of society. In other words, for participating in government, spending significant amounts of time pursuing artistic or scientific developments, etc. But now, modern industry has made it possible to distribute labor among all members of society. So this distinction between working class and ruling class has to be maintained more and more artificially, as there really aren't any kind of technological limitations, meaning that some people have to spend all this time working, while a few people direct society. Now, the capitalist class, which is to be the last exploiting class in history, quote, has become superfluous and indeed a hindrance to social development, and will inexorably be abolished. And this despite, as Engels says, however much it may be in possession of, Dühring's term, direct force. So the capitalist class can have all the weapons, all of the force that can be used as power against the population, but even this will ultimately be insufficient to stop this historical process, which is again determined by the development of industry and the social implications that that has. Continuing. When, therefore, Herr Dühring turns up his nose at Hellenism because it was founded on slavery, he might with equal justice reproach the Greeks with having had no steam engines or electric telegraphs. And when he asserts that our modern wage bondage can only be explained as a somewhat transformed and mitigated heritage of slavery, and not by its own nature, that is, by the economic laws of modern society, this either means only that both wage labor and slavery are forms of bondage and class domination, which every child knows to be so, or is false. For with equal justice we might say that wage labor could only be explained as a mitigated form of cannibalism, which, it is now established, was the universal primitive form of utilization of defeated enemies. The role played in history by force as contrasted with economic development is therefore clear. In the first place, all political power is organically based on an economic, social function, and increases in proportion as the members of society, through the dissolution of the primitive community, become transformed into private producers, and thus become more and more divorced from the administrators of the common functions of society. Secondly, after the political force has made itself independent in relation to society and has transformed itself from its servant into its master, it can work in two different directions. Either it works in the sense and in the direction of the natural economic development, in which case no conflict arises between them, the economic development being accelerated, or it works against economic development, in which case, as a rule, with but few exceptions, force succumbs to it. These few exceptions are isolated cases of conquest, in which the more barbarian conquerors exterminated or drove out the population of a country and laid waste or allowed to go to ruin productive forces which they did not know how to use. This was what the Christians in Moorish Spain did with the major part of the irrigation works, on which the highly developed agriculture and horticulture of the Moors depended. Every conquest by a more barbarian people disturbs, of course, the economic development and destroys numerous productive forces. But in the immense majority of cases where the conquest is permanent, the more barbarian conqueror has to adapt himself to the higher economic situation as it emerges from the conquest. He is assimilated by the vanquished, and in most cases he even has to adopt their language. So commenting, what Engels is saying here is, as far as the relationship between force and the economic situation, even if there is a less developed people which has more force or, better fighting technique or something, and manages by force to conquer another people who have a more advanced economic situation, they're more technologically and socially developed, then the conqueror actually gets assimilated into that population because, despite a lack of force, it is more advanced, more efficient economically. That is, at least if that conquest is to last. So congrats, you forced your way into the new society as a, quote, conqueror, but really you're not imposing your way of life on those people. You're just forcibly assimilating yourself into their way of life. And why does he mention this? Because this is the whole point of these theory of force chapters, which he is rebutting. Dühring, in other words, has it completely backwards as regards the force versus economic situation relationship. Continuing. But where, apart from cases of conquest, the internal state power of a country becomes antagonistic to its economic development, as at a certain stage occurred with almost every political power in the past, the contest always ended with the downfall of the political power. Inexorably and without exception, the economic development has forced its way through. We have already mentioned the latest and most striking example of this, the Great French Revolution. If, in accordance with Herr Dühring's theory, the economic situation, and with it the economic structure of a given country, were dependent simply on political force, it is absolutely impossible to understand why Frederick William IV, after 1848, could not succeed, in spite of his, quote, magnificent army, in grafting the medieval guilds and other romantic oddities onto the railways, the steam engines, and the large-scale industry which was just then developing in his country, or why the Tsar of Russia, who is possessed of even much more forcible means, is not only unable to pay his debts, but cannot even maintain his force without continually borrowing from the economic situation of Western Europe. To Herr Dühring, force is the absolute evil. The first act of force is to him the original sin. His whole exposition is a jeremiad on the contamination of all subsequent history consummated by this original sin, a jeremiad on the shameful perversion of all natural and social laws by this diabolical power, force. That force, however, plays yet another role in history, a revolutionary role, that, in the words of Marx, it is the midwife of every old society pregnant with a new one, that it is the instrument with the aid of which social movement forces its way through and shatters the dead, fossilized political forms. Of this there is not a word in Herr Dühring. It is only with sighs and groans that he admits the possibility that force will perhaps be necessary for the overthrow of an economic system of exploitation. Unfortunately, because all use of force demoralizes the person who uses it. And this in spite of the immense moral and spiritual impetus which has been given by every victorious revolution. And this in Germany, where a violent collision, which may, after all, be forced on the people, would at least have the advantage of wiping out the servility which has penetrated the nation's mentality following the humiliation of the 30 Years' War. And this parson's mode of thought, dull, insipid, and impotent, presumes to impose itself on the most revolutionary party that history has known.